Have you ever been truly alone? Not just by yourself in a quiet house, but utterly, completely isolated, miles from the nearest road, with nothing but the vast, ancient forest for company. Imagine the kind of silence that hums, where the only sounds are the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, or the gentle creak of an old cabin as it settles. It's a profound solitude that can either bring deep peace or, if you're unlucky, strip away every layer of comfort until you're left with nothing but raw, exposed nerves. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. So, before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unique, let me know your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, feel the air grow colder, and try to ignore the shadows dancing at the corner of your eye. Let's dive together into tonight's nightmare. My name is Alex. For the past 5 years, I've been a park ranger in one of the most remote national forests in the Pacific Northwest, a place of towering redwoods, mist-shrouded valleys, and in quiet that could swallow you whole. My posting was about as isolated as it gets, a small, sturdy cabin nestled deep within the trees, accessible only by a winding gravel road that often became impassable in the heavier winter months. Most rangers rotated out every few weeks, but I loved it there. The solitude was a balm to my soul, a stark contrast to the constant noise and rush of city life I'd left behind. My days were spent patrolling trails, checking on campsites, monitoring wildlife, and occasionally assisting lost hikers, though those were rare, given how few people ventured this deep. My nights were spent reading, listening to the crackle of a wood stove, and sometimes just staring out at the impenetrable darkness, feeling like I was the last person left on Earth. The cabin itself was basic but functional. A single room with a cot, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and a table where I'd spread out maps and reports. There was no internet, no cell service, just a satellite phone for emergencies, which I rarely touched. The only source of light after dark was a few battery-powered lanterns and the flickering glow from my hearth. The closest town was a 3-hour drive, and even that was more of a large village than a bustling hub. Most of my supplies came in once a month via a park service truck. It was a simple life, a good life, and for years, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. The forest was predictable. Its cycles of growth and decay, the migration of animals, the changing seasons. It all moved with an ancient rhythm that brought me a deep sense of peace. I knew the sounds of the forest like the back of my hand. The hoot of a great horned owl, the rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush, the distinct, almost human-like cry of a bobcat on the hunt. I knew what was normal and what was not. One of my regular duties was maintaining the trail markers. In a place like this, with dense foliage and often poorly defined paths, a misplaced or damaged marker could lead a hiker dangerously off course. I spent countless hours hiking those trails, hammer and nails in hand, ensuring every sign was visible and secure. Some of these markers were decades old, weathered by countless storms, and it was a small but satisfying task to replace them, knowing I was helping keep people safe in this beautiful, wild place. This was a grounding detail of my routine, a tangible connection to the practicalities of my job, and it provided a bedrock of normalcy that would soon prove crucial. My nights were quiet, usually spent updating reports, meticulously noting any unusual animal sightings or environmental changes. The constant hum of cicadas in summer, the eerie silence of snow-laden branches in winter, these were my lullabies. I remember one particular evening, as autumn was beginning to bleed into winter. The air had a sharp, metallic bite to it, and the leaves were turning a fiery red and gold. I was sitting by the stove, a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hand, listening to the wind outside. It wasn't a strong wind, just a gentle, consistent sighing that whispered through the ancient pines. Something felt different that night, though. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and distant animal calls seemed subdued. The forest was quieter than it should have been. It wasn't an absolute silence, but a kind of hush, as if every creature was holding its breath. I attributed it to the changing weather, perhaps a cold front moving in, causing the wildlife to seek shelter. But deep down, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of unease started to ripple through my calm. This unusual quiet, though easily dismissed, was my first foreshadowing detail, a subtle shift in the natural rhythm I so deeply trusted. I stood up, walked to the single window, and peered out into the darkness. My breath fogged the glass. Beyond the small clearing around my cabin, the trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers against the sliver of moon. I flicked on my powerful flashlight and swept the beam across the surrounding woods. Nothing. Just the familiar trunks, the undergrowth, the inky blackness. But then, as the beam passed over a particularly dense cluster of conifers about 50 yards from my cabin, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement. A shadow that seemed too deep, too solid to be just part of the forest. It was gone almost instantly, swallowed by the darkness. I held the light steady on the spot, straining my eyes, but there was nothing there. Just the swaying branches. I exhaled slowly, telling myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps just a deer moving silently through the woods. It was easy to imagine things out here, alone in the dark. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me, or I was overtired. That fleeting, dismissed observation, the shadow that wasn't quite there, but left an impression, was my element of ambiguity, the first seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of my isolated peace. I stood there for a few more minutes, the feeling of unease clinging to me like the damp night air, before finally shrugging it off and heading back to the stove. It was just the forest, I told myself. Always just the forest. The next few weeks passed much like any others, a monotonous rhythm of patrols, reports, and the endless, beautiful quiet. The feeling of unease from that night faded, chalked up to an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. But then subtle things started to shift, things so small, so negligible, that I initially dismissed them as coincidence, or perhaps signs that I was simply becoming too attuned to the forest's nuances. It started with sound, not the distinct animal calls I was familiar with, but something different. Low, almost guttural scraping noises that seemed to emanate from the deeper woods, usually after midnight. They weren't constant. They would begin, last a few minutes, then cease as abruptly as they'd started. My first thought was a bear, perhaps scratching its back against a tree, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate for an animal. It sounded heavy, like something being dragged or pulled across rough bark. I'd grab my powerful spotlight and scan the tree line, but the sounds would stop the moment my light touched the clearing. When I turned it off, sometimes they would resume, faint and unsettling. I even tried creeping out onto the porch once, standing absolutely still in the frigid air, listening. The sounds were there, faint but unmistakable, coming from the north side of my cabin, where the forest was particularly dense and untouched. Then there were the tracks, small things at first. My patrol route took me past a seasonal creek, and I often checked the muddy banks for animal prints. I'd see deer, elk, the occasional coyote, but twice I found marks that didn't quite fit. They were long, narrow indentations, almost like shallow furrows, running parallel to each other. Too straight for a fallen branch being dragged by the wind, too deep for an animal's tail. At first I thought maybe it was a fallen log, or debris from a recent small landslide, but they'd appear in places where there was no logical explanation, and they always seemed to lead away from my cabin, deeper into the forest. I'd trace them for a few yards, but they'd inevitably disappear into the thicker undergrowth, lost amongst the fallen leaves and tangled roots. This was my grounding detail, a practical aspect of my job that suddenly fell off. My job was to understand the forest, to read its signs, but these signs were unreadable, defying conventional explanation. One afternoon, I was returning from a long patrol, the air crisp and cold, signaling the true onset of winter. I was perhaps a mile from the cabin, walking along a part of the trail that ran adjacent to a steep, rocky incline. It was a familiar stretch, and I knew every crevice, every twisted root. As I walked, I noticed something glinting faintly in the late afternoon sun, high up on the incline, near a small cluster of ancient, gnarled oaks. It was unusual enough to catch my eye. I scrambled up the loose scree, carefully pulling myself up using exposed roots until I reached the spot. Tucked into a narrow fissure in the rock face, almost perfectly camouflaged by lichen and moss, was a small, crudely carved wooden idol. It was no bigger than my hand, shaped vaguely like a human figure but with elongated limbs and a head that was too large, too round, with no discernible features aside from two deeply gouged holes for eyes. It looked ancient, weathered, almost like something you'd see in an old anthropological museum, but it also looked fresh. The wood around the gouges seemed recently disturbed. I picked it up, feeling its rough texture, its surprising weight. It wasn't natural, not a piece of nature, but something made and placed intentionally, and it was facing my cabin. My blood ran cold despite the chill in the air. This was utterly unlike anything I'd ever found in the park, and I'd seen odd things before, from forgotten camping gear to ancient arrowheads. This felt different. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a marker. I brought the idol back to the cabin, placing it on my table. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize it. A hiker's lost trinket, a prank. But who would venture this deep for a prank, and why place it facing my cabin? The thought lingered, a small, persistent burr under my skin. That night the scraping sounds returned, louder than before, closer to the cabin. I lay in my cot, eyes wide open, listening to the rhythmic drag, drag, drag. It sounded like something heavy and hard being pulled over uneven ground, just beyond the reach of my porch light. I considered going out, but something held me back. A primal instinct, perhaps, telling me that whatever was making that noise, I didn't want to meet it in the dark. The next morning, I found one of the wooden trail markers, one I had personally secured just a week prior, lying on the ground, leaning against a tree about 30 yards from my cabin. It hadn't fallen. The nails were still in the tree, bent and twisted, as if something had ripped the marker directly off with immense force. The wood splintered around the nail holes, fresh breaks in the weathered timber. My stomach dropped. This was no animal. No bear or elk could have done this. This was deliberate. This was my foreshadowing detail. The strange, unidentifiable scraping sounds from before now clearly linked to a physical, destructive presence. The broken marker was a message. I spent the day repairing the marker, my senses heightened, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig making me jump. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, my hand never far from the old, 3.6 rifle I kept loaded by the door. That night the air was particularly still and cold. No wind, no sounds, just the crackle of my wood stove. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window. The cabin felt small, vulnerable. Around midnight the scraping started again. This time it wasn't distant. It was right outside. I could hear the distinct sound of something heavy being dragged against the rough wood of a fallen log just outside the perimeter of my small clearing. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate. My heart pounded against my ribs. I held my breath, listening, trying to pinpoint the exact location. It seemed to be moving, circling the cabin slowly. Drag, then a pause. Then another drag further away, moving almost imperceptibly around my small domain. I told myself it was fine. It had to be an animal, a very heavy, very methodical animal. Maybe a bear finding something to rub against, but the sound was too consistent, too unnatural. It wasn't the agitated huffing or snorting of a typical animal. This was quiet, purposeful. It was the sound of work. I strained my ears, trying to discern any other noise, any breathing, any rustle of fur. There was nothing but the rhythmic scrape. I felt a cold dread wrapping around me. I was a park ranger, experienced in the wilderness, comfortable with its dangers, but this was an unknown. This was a fear I had never encountered before. It was something in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my lights, moving around my cabin in the dead of night. Could it be a person, a hermit, a squatter? Unlikely. Park rangers knew this area. No one lived this deep in the forest, not without being detected. But what else could make those sounds and move with such deliberate, almost intelligent intent? This profound uncertainty, the active questioning of what I was hearing versus what I believed to be possible, became my element of ambiguity. It was the moment I realized the forest, my comfort, could also be alien and terrifying. I lay there rigid until the first hint of pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, and the scraping sounds finally, mercifully, ceased. Sleep became a luxury. Every night the scraping sounds would return, sometimes faint, sometimes alarmingly close. They were always accompanied by that profound quiet, the absence of natural nocturnal sounds, as if the forest itself held its breath when whatever it was started its activities. I began to notice other small things too. Small stones on my porch, arranged in an odd pattern, not quite a circle, more of an irregular spiral. I'd kick them away, only to find them rearranged the next morning. My mind screamed coincidence, but a chill always ran down my spine. My days were still spent on patrol, but now with a constant sense of being watched. I'd find myself stopping frequently, turning around abruptly, scanning the dense foliage, convinced I saw a movement in my peripheral vision, a darker shade amongst the shadow. But there was never anything there. Just the swaying trees, the dappled sunlight, the endless expanse of wilderness. My once comforting solitude now felt like a suffocating isolation, a spotlight on my vulnerability. It was as if the forest was no longer a sanctuary, but a watchful, patient entity with eyes everywhere. One afternoon, I was checking a particularly remote section of trail that followed an old logging road. The ground was soft and muddy from recent rains. As I walked, I noticed a series of fresh tracks. They were large, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not paw prints, not hoof prints. They were oddly shaped, almost like a misshapen human foot, but with too many toes and what looked like blunt, almost claw-like indentations at the end. The stride was long, unnaturally so, as if whatever made them moved in powerful, loping strides. And what truly unnerved me was that these tracks were interspersed with the same long, narrow furrows I'd seen by the creek, as if something was being dragged between the steps of this creature. This became my grounding detail, something tangible and undeniably physical. This wasn't just sounds or shadows. This was a distinct, unidentifiable physical presence. No known animal could make these marks. I followed them for a quarter mile, my heart thumping, until they vanished into a patch of dense, thorny brambles too thick for me to safely penetrate. I took a photo with my phone, though I knew there was no signal to send it. Just for myself, proof that I wasn't imagining things. Back at the cabin, I felt an almost unbearable urge to call someone, anyone, to report what I was experiencing. But who would I call? The Park Service higher-ups? They'd think I was cracking under the pressure of isolation, or suggest I was delusional. Tracks, ranger. What kind of tracks? Bears? No. Well, sounds like you need a vacation. I was alone out here, truly alone, and whatever was happening, I had to deal with it myself. Not that I knew how to deal with it. The subtle changes intensified. My supplies, which I meticulously organized, would sometimes be out of place. A can of beans moved from the shelf to the counter. My lantern, which I always hung on a specific hook, found resting on the floor. Small things, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness. But the unsettling part was that my single door was always locked, the windows latched. There was no sign of forced entry. It was as if something was getting inside without leaving a trace, subtly manipulating my environment. This was my element of ambiguity, the disorienting feeling that my reality was being tampered with, that my own memory or perception was failing me, or that the impossible was occurring. One night the scraping started again, but this time it was accompanied by something new, something that froze the blood in my veins. A low, guttural moan. It wasn't animalistic. It was too deep, too resonant, almost like a hum, but filled with an ancient sorrow. It seemed to come from directly behind the cabin, lasting only a few seconds before fading into the scraping again. I gripped my rifle, my knuckles white, sweat beading on my forehead despite the freezing cabin air. I thought about the idol on my table, the one with the empty eyes, facing the cabin. Did it have something to do with this? Was it a warning or an invitation? I barely slept that night. The moaning continued intermittently, a haunting refrain that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the cabin. It sounded like something in immense pain or immense loneliness, or perhaps something else entirely, something singing a song of ancient dread. Just before dawn, the scraping and moaning stopped. I ventured out onto the porch, my rifle held tight, and swept my powerful flashlight over the ground. The early morning mist hung heavy, making everything look ethereal and indistinct. I saw nothing, but as I rounded the back of the cabin, the beam caught on something. Scratches, deep, ugly gouges in the old, untreated wood of the cabin wall, just below the small window where my cot was. They were long, parallel marks, 3 of them, as if something with blunt claws had dragged itself down the wall. The wood was splintered, raw, the marks undeniably fresh. It wasn't a bear. Bear claws leave distinct individual marks, and these were too long, too uniform, and too high up the wall to be anything but bipedal. This was my foreshadowing detail, the evidence on the cabin wall, a terrifying confirmation that whatever was out there wasn't just observing or making noise. It was physically interacting with my perceived safe space. It was testing the boundaries. I touched the raw wood, a shiver running through me. The cold air suddenly felt predatory. Whatever it was, it had been right outside my window, just inches from my head, while I lay in my bed. It could have seen me. It could have heard me breathing. It had been there. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just being watched, I was being visited. And whatever was doing this, it wasn't a human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I felt a profound sense of violation, of my sanctuary being breached irrevocably. I spent the rest of the morning boarding up that window, using heavy planks of wood I'd salvaged from an old storage shed. It wouldn't stop anything truly determined, but it made me feel marginally safer. That night I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the stove, rifle across my lap, watching the windows, listening to the silence, waiting. And the silence was even worse than the sounds. It was the silence of something waiting. The silence of something watching me, perhaps from the very edge of my clearing, just beyond the reach of my lights. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. It was getting closer. The nights blurred into a terrifying routine. The scratching, the moaning, the occasional thud against the cabin walls, they became the new normal, each sound a fresh spike of adrenaline. I stopped dismissing the moved items as my own absent-mindedness. Every morning something would be subtly out of place. My axe, which I kept by the woodpile outside, would be leaning against my porch railing, its blade facing the cabin door. A rock would be placed just outside my front door, as if someone had just placed it there. It was a game, I realized, a deliberate psychological torture designed to wear me down, to make me doubt my own sanity. This quiet manipulation, the subtle invasion of my personal space, was more terrifying than any direct threat. My sleep schedule was non-existent. I'd nap for an hour or two during the day, always with one ear listening, my rifle within arm's reach. The constant vigilance was exhausting, stripping away my mental fortitude, leaving me raw and vulnerable. My patrols became shorter, always staying within sight of the cabin. The trails which once brought me solace now felt like open invitations for whatever was stalking me. The forest, once my home, was now a hostile entity, its vastness a cover for unspeakable things. One blustery afternoon, I was splitting firewood near the edge of the clearing. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful sound that perfectly matched my mood. My back was to the woods, a foolish position, but I was tired, weary to my bones. As I raised the axe for another swing, a sudden sharp crack echoed from the tree line directly behind me. It wasn't a branch falling. It was too precise, too deliberate. It sounded like a heavy footfall on dry leaves, followed by a slight rustle. I froze, axe raised, muscles locked. The wind momentarily died down, and in that sudden silence I heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible scrape against bark, very close. I spun around, axe still in hand, scanning the dense trees. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical weight on my shoulders. Then about 50 feet into the trees I saw it. A piece of bark, freshly torn from a thick pine tree, about 10 feet up, lay on the ground. The tier itself looked like it had been peeled off, not broken. And above it on the trunk were 3 distinct deep gouges, similar to the ones on my cabin wall, but much larger, as if something enormous had dragged powerful claws down the bark. This newfound evidence, undeniably physical and undeniably fresh, serving as my grounding detail, solidified the terrifying reality that this entity was not just observing. It was capable of immense physical force and was actively asserting its presence. I didn't wait. I dropped the axe, scrambled to the cabin, and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the key. I peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. The forest was still, the wind picking up again, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been out there was still out there, just beyond my sight. It wasn't hiding from me. It was letting me know it was there. That night, the activity escalated. The scraping around the cabin was constant, no longer intermittent. It was a relentless, dragging sound that seemed to circle my cabin without pause. The moan returned, too, deeper and more guttural than before, almost a growl, reverberating through my small dwelling. It sounded like something was in immense distress, or perhaps immense anger. Then a new sound began, tapping. A rhythmic, soft tap-tap-tap against the wooden wall directly opposite my cot. It was so close, I could almost feel the vibrations in my bones. It was too soft for a branch, too deliberate for an animal. It was a gentle, insistent knock, as if something was patiently trying to get my attention, or perhaps testing the integrity of the wall. This was my element of ambiguity, the persistent tapping creating a profound internal conflict. Was it a calculated, intelligent gesture or some random mechanical sound? The ambiguity was paralyzing. I loaded my rifle, chambering a round with a terrifying click that sounded deafening in the silence. I sat on my cot, rifle aimed at the wall, my heart hammering. The tapping continued, slowly, deliberately. Each tap echoed in the silence, building an unbearable tension. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was useless. It felt like it was tapping directly on my skull. Then the tapping stopped, the scraping stopped, the moaning stopped. An absolute, profound silence descended, heavier than any I had experienced before. My breath hitched in my throat. This was worse, much, much worse. The silence pulsed with a latent threat, a coiled readiness. I gripped the rifle, my knuckles white, my whole body tensed, waiting. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My ears strained, trying to pick up any sound, any indication. Nothing. Not a single rustle of leaves, not a breath of wind. It was as if the forest itself had ceased to exist, replaced by a suffocating void. Then a sharp thump against the front door. Not a gentle tap, but a heavy, solid impact. The entire cabin shuddered. My eyes darted to the door. I heard the distinct sound of wood splintering, followed by a low, drawn-out groan that vibrated through the floorboards. It was right there on the other side of my thin wooden door, and it was trying to get in. This was my foreshadowing detail. The deliberate, patient testing of the cabin's boundaries now confirmed its aggressive intent. The direct impact on the door was the final, undeniable escalation. I scrambled off the cot, moving silently to the door, rifle raised. I could hear heavy breathing on the other side, a deep, raspy inhale and exhale, slow and deliberate. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something acrid, like old, wet fur and decay. A faint scratching sound began, focused around the doorknob, then slowly moving up the door. Not sharp claws, but something blunt, like fingers scraping against the wood, searching. I could hear the doorknob rattling faintly, gently. It wasn't trying to force it open. It was gently turning it, testing it, as if it expected it to open on its own. It stopped, and then I heard a low, almost curious sniff from the other side. My breath caught in my throat. It was smelling me. It knew I was there. I heard a soft, wet sound, like something pressing against the wood, right where my face would be if I were standing conventionally by the door. A cold, heavy pressure formed against the wood. I pressed myself against the farthest wall, rifle still raised, pointing uselessly at the door. It was no longer just watching. It was actively trying to breach my last sanctuary, and I had no idea what it was or what it wanted. The pressure on the door intensified, then scraped downwards, a long, drawn-out groan of stressed wood. Whatever was out there wasn't just observing anymore. It was actively trying to break in. I could hear heavy, wet breathing on the other side, punctuated by soft thuds as something leaned its full weight against the thin wood. My hands were slick with sweat, my vision blurring at the edges from sheer exhaustion and terror. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? Deeper into the dark, hostile forest. This tiny cabin was my only defense, and it felt like tissue paper against the unknown force outside. A loud crack ripped through the night as one of the door's old hinges gave way. The door sagged inward slightly, revealing a sliver of inky blackness. A sickening smell, like a swamp mixed with something rotten and metallic, wafted into the cabin. My stomach lurched. I backed away, my rifle still leveled, my finger hovering over the trigger. I had never fired this rifle at anything other than a target during training. I didn't know if it would even be effective against whatever this was. But it was all I had. Then through the gap I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, just a glimpse. A patch of darkness, deeper than the night, with a texture that seemed to absorb what little light escaped from my lantern. It was rough, almost like matted, coarse fur, but it moved with an unsettling fluidity, not like any animal hide I knew. It was impossibly black, a void that shifted and pulsed. There was no distinct shape, just an amorphous, massive presence pressing against the door. And then slowly, a long, unnaturally slender appendage, as black as the fur, slid through the gap. It was rough, segmented, like a broken tree branch, but it moved with an eerie, intelligent grace. It tapered to a blunt, almost finger-like end, and slowly, deliberately, it reached towards the inside of the door, searching for the latch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drumbeat of panic. This was my element of ambiguity, the profound, terrifying uncertainty of what I was witnessing, a shape that defied categorization, an appendage that was both organic and utterly alien. I fired. The roar of the rifle in the confined space was deafening, a physical shockwave that vibrated through my bones. A flash of muzzle light illuminated the cabin for a split second, and in that fleeting moment, I saw the appendage recoil sharply. There was a wet, gurgling sound from outside, a choked, raspy cry that was both animalistic and horribly human. A smell of decay intensified, burning my nostrils. The pressure on the door vanished. I stood there, rifle still smoking, ears ringing, breathing heavily, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Had I hit it? What was it? Silence descended once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't the waiting silence from before. It was the silence of something wounded or something retreating. I listened intently, straining to hear any movement, any indication that it was still out there. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously moved to the door, peering through the shattered hinge gap. The forest was dark, silent, still, too still. I could see nothing, but the smell lingered, a sickening reminder of the encounter. My grounding detail, the pungent, acrid smell of decay and the lingering echoes of that choked cry, confirmed that this was a physical being, bleeding and in pain, not some spectral presence or figment of my imagination. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, rifle across my lap, staring at the damaged door. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the cabin seemed like the return of the creature. I knew I couldn't stay. This place, my once beloved sanctuary, was now a tomb, a trap. As soon as the sun rose, I would leave. I would abandon the cabin, my job, everything. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. The first slivers of dawn painted the sky in muted grays and purples. I rose stiffly, my body screaming from the ordeal. I checked my supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, my satellite phone, and most importantly, extra ammunition. I packed a small backpack, leaving everything else behind. My eyes kept darting to the door, to the broken hinge, the faint, discolored smear on the wood that was too dark to be dirt. Before I left, compelled by a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for understanding, I crept to the back of the cabin. I found what I was looking for. There, on the ground, amongst the pine needles and fallen leaves, was a dark, viscous trail. It was thick, almost oily, and unmistakably blood. It was a darker shade than human blood, almost black in the pre-dawn light, and had that same pungent, metallic smell. The trail was wide, as if something large and heavy had dragged itself away, heading deep into the forest. This was my foreshadowing detail. The blood trail, confirming the injury, but also suggesting that the entity was still alive, still out there, lurking, waiting. I followed the trail for about 50 yards, my rifle held ready. The blood was fresh, still glistening. It led me to a small rise, where the trees grew particularly dense, their branches weaving together to form a near-impenetrable canopy. The trail disappeared into the undergrowth, too thick to follow without a machete. I scanned the area, my gaze lingering on the dark shadows between the trees. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence, a cold malevolence radiating from the depths of the forest. It was there, watching me, waiting. I turned and fled. I didn't run heedlessly, but with a desperate, ground-eating stride, following the familiar path towards the main road, towards anything resembling civilization. I kept my head on a swivel, my eyes darting into the woods, convinced at any moment I would hear the scraping, hear the moan, or see that impossible black shape burst from the trees. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every sound seemed amplified, turning the familiar forest into a terrifying labyrinth. I didn't stop until I stumbled onto the rough gravel of the access road, miles from the cabin. I kept walking, then running, until I reached the ranger station outpost, a small, rarely manned shack closer to the main highway. I burst through the door, my breath ragged, my body shaking uncontrollably. The ranger on duty, a younger man named Mark, looked up, startled, his eyes widening at my disheveled appearance. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come, only choked gasps. I pointed back the way I came, my finger trembling. The cabin, I managed to rasp. Something in the forest. Mark looked at me, then at the rifle still clutched in my hand, and slowly, concern replaced his surprise. I had escaped, but the terror was etched into my very soul. Mark was a good kid. He didn't ask too many questions at first, just got me some water and let me sit by the crackling radio, trying to calm down. He could see the absolute terror in my eyes, the way my hands still trembled, the wild look that probably painted my face. I finally managed to relate the story, stuttering through the details, omitting the more unbelievable parts about the shape and the appendage. I stuck to the facts, the strange noises, the moved objects, the gouges on the cabin, the broken hinge, the shot I fired, the blood trail. He listened patiently, his face growing paler with each revelation. He said he'd call it in, but I could tell he was skeptical, trying to find a rational explanation. Bears, maybe, or a very large, aggressive cougar. But the part about the door, the splintered wood, and the smell, he couldn't easily dismiss that. The Park Service sent a team out the next morning, not an investigation team, more like a recovery crew for my belongings. I wasn't allowed to go back. They cited stress leave and potential for a dangerous animal encounter. They kept me at the outpost, away from the scene. It took them nearly a full day to get to the cabin and back. When they returned, their faces were grim. The cabin door was indeed heavily damaged, one hinge completely ripped from the frame. There were deep gouges on the outer wall, just as I had described. They confirmed the strange, blackish-red fluid on the ground, but couldn't identify it. No animal they knew of bled that way. They followed the trail of this fluid into the woods, but it vanished abruptly after about 100 yards, as if whatever made it had simply ceased to be. There were no tracks, no sign of a body. My rifle shell casing was recovered from the cabin floor. The wooden idol I had found was gone from the table. The small spiral of stones was on my porch again. They found nothing else definitive. No monster, no explanation. Just the lingering, unsettling evidence of something. This was my grounding detail, the Park Service's confirmation of the physical evidence, validating my sanity, yet the lack of an explanation only deepened the mystery. I was transferred to a desk job in a regional office, far from the silence and solitude of the wilderness. They said I needed time to readjust. The truth was, they didn't know what to do with me. I was a ranger who had seen something that didn't exist, something that left physical proof but no scientific explanation. My days were now filled with paperwork, the fluorescent lights of the office a stark, jarring contrast to the open sky and ancient trees. I tried to forget to move on, but the images were burned into my mind. The black shifting shape, the slender appendage, the gurgling cry, the acrid smell. Every rustle outside my apartment window, every creak of the old building sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I checked my locks compulsively, several times a night. I slept with a knife under my pillow. The comfortable anonymity of city life couldn't erase the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something malevolent existed just beyond the veil of understanding. I became obsessed with the old stories, the folklore of the region. Local legends of forest spirits, of ancient beings that predated humanity, of things that lived in the deep, untouched wilderness. I read accounts of cryptids and unexplained disappearances. Nothing fit perfectly, but the collective dread, the common thread of an unknown, ancient presence in the woods, resonated deeply. Was it a physical creature, some undiscovered apex predator, or something else entirely, something supernatural, something that defied the very laws of our understanding? The Park Service eventually sealed off that section of the forest, citing unusual animal activity and dangerous terrain. They never openly acknowledged what I saw, but they didn't need to. Their actions spoke volumes. The silence that had once brought me peace now felt like a predatory presence, always just out of earshot. I often wonder what became of it. Did it die from my bullet? Did it just retreat, nursing its wounds, lurking in the dark, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to disturb its ancient domain? I think about the idol, the one with the empty eyes, that was gone from my cabin. Was it a protection or a sign? And those crude, elongated figures I had seen in various folklore books. Some ancient cultures spoke of forest walkers or shadow people who protected the old growth and sometimes punished those who intruded too deeply. This constant, unresolvable questioning of the entity's nature and intent, the inability to categorize it, was my persistent element of ambiguity. It was a terrifying puzzle with no solution. I know what I saw. I know what I endured. The scars aren't just on my mind, they're etched into my soul. I'll never again look at a dense forest with the same peace. The rustling leaves, the shifting shadows, the profound silence, they all carry a new, sinister meaning. What happened to me out there, alone in that cabin, proved that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist just beyond the reach of our understanding, patiently waiting in the dark. This was my foreshadowing detail, the deep-seated trauma that prevents me from ever fully escaping the forest's lingering grip, its malevolent spirit forever a part of me. Sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet and the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear it. Not the dragging sound, not the moan, but something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tap 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 against my window. I know it's just the wind or a branch, but I can never bring myself to look. I just close my eyes, pull the covers tighter, and pray for the dawn. It's been years now since I left that cabin, since I abandoned the life I loved in the heart of the forest. The physical distance is immense, but the psychological one feels non-existent. The wilderness, once a source of profound peace, now haunts my every waking thought, a silent, dark presence just at the edge of my memory. I often find myself staring out at the urban landscape, at the safety of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic, and yet I feel more exposed than ever. The rational part of my mind tries to construct explanations. An undiscovered animal, a hermit suffering from a severe mental illness, an elaborate prank, but none of those explanations quell the cold dread that settles in my chest whenever night falls. The memory of that black shifting mass, the unsettling intelligence in its actions, the raw primal fear that gripped me, it all lingers, a persistent phantom limb of terror. I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear the soft, rhythmic drag just outside my window, or the low, mournful moan vibrating through the floorboard. The world feels thinner now, more porous. I know, with chilling certainty, that there are things that exist beyond the comforting boundaries of our understanding, ancient forces that stir in the deepest, darkest places. And sometimes, if you're alone enough, if you listen closely enough, they stir for you.